Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to hear Bruce Fein for our summer speaker series with our interns. Bruce is one of my favorite speakers of the year, probably my favorite, to be honest with you. He is a graduate from Harvard Law School with honors. He was Associate Deputy Attorney General of the United States under Ronald Reagan. He's an adjunct scholar with the American Enterprise Institute. He's a resident scholar at the Heritage Foundation, a lecturer at the Brookings Institute, and an adjunct professor at George Washington University. He's authored a number of books. One of my favorite is American Empire Before the Fall, which he'll be speaking about today. He also writes a weekly column for the Washington Times. He's assisted at least 24 countries in constitutional revision and advised over 20 heads of state around the world and presidents of foreign nations. Thank you for coming.
As the Roman Republic degenerated into the Roman Empire, Tacitus wrote, "The worst crimes were dared by a few, willed by more, and tolerated by all." As the Weimar Republic degenerated into the Third Reich, the worst crimes were dared by a few, willed by more, tolerated by all. As the United States Republic has degenerated into an empire where a president can plot assassinations, kill this in the White House unilaterally, in secret, where the president can dispatch the military and tell anyone you're on a trip to Guantanamo Bay based on secret evidence, where the president can flout the Constitution's entrustment of the power to initiate war with impunity, and a litany of other usurpations. The worst of these crimes has been dared by a few, willed by more, and unfortunately tolerated by all, at least at present. It is truly stunning for me, who came to Washington some 40 years ago, the time of the Watergate crisis, and participated in the impeachment proceedings that led to President Nixon's resignation. And when it was thought outrageous that a president might authorize the burglarizing of the office of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, and that the Fourth Amendment meant something more than that the president could not examine your books, examine and scrutinize your home, search and seize all of your records without probable cause. That at that time, what President Nixon did was viewed as an impeachable offense, and indeed outrageous. It was thought incredible that then Attorney General John Mitchell would be plotting with G. Gordon Liddy, burglarizing of the Democratic National Committee headquarters at Watergate. That was it. Now it's moved to the Oval Office. And yet, and at the time of Watergate, when there was a particular crisis, when on October 20th, 1973, President Nixon ordered the firing of Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, that 2 million Americans wrote in telegrams within 24 hours saying, "Mr. President, if he's not replaced, you should be impeached." And at present, with vastly greater crimes against the Constitution, crimes against international law perpetrated by the President, and openly acknowledged, if not boasted about, in places like the New York Times, the reaction of the American people, the Congress, has been astonishingly complacent, if not silent. And I feel as an American, I'm ashamed. We, as a country, have turned into King George III on steroids. If you read the indictment against King George in the Declaration of Independence and compare them to what the United States is doing at present, not only domestically but abroad, they pale in comparison. And let me give an inexhaustive list of what I believe are the most egregious offenses, constitutional crimes of the presidency and the Congress in some sense, because they're complicit by inaction and sometimes they attempt to authorize what the president is doing, like the Military Commissions Act or the National Defense Authorization Act. And to my mind, the most egregious usurpation, the most dangerous, the usurpation that resembles the power of King George III to go to war without parliamentary authorization is the president's claim. So this is one of his U.S. legal counsel memos that's not locked in a safe in the Department of Justice, which he claims that he can initiate war anytime he believes it's important for regional security, the credibility of the UN Security Council, or any other reason in the national interest. In other words, he can declare and initiate war at his whim. There's one thing that the Founding Fathers were united upon. From those who were in favor of the most muscular executive like Alexander Hamilton, to those who were very, very fearful of a powerful executive like George Mason, it was the executive should never have authority unilaterally to go to war. And they all chorused. All of the history of mankind showed that it was the executive branch that was inclined to concoct danger to justify war, for a very simple reason. In war, all the power goes to the executive. The taxes, the contracts, the appointments, the footprints in the sand of time, the patriotism, all goes to the executive branch. And so they had examined all the wars in Europe at the time. They were initiated by emperors, by monarchs, by executive authorities, not by legislative bodies. Because legislative bodies lose power in times. And therefore it said we had to clog the arteries towards war by insisting only the House and the Senate, voting concurrently to authorize war, would justify the United States from crossing that Rubicon. And let's pause for a moment and ask, why does it make such an important difference to separate a state of war from a state of peace? Why was that of such enormous concern? It's because what war does, it makes what's customarily murder legal. Think about it. War, the definition of war is makes what's customarily murder legal. So you want to be very exacting on deciding whether you cross that Rubicon. It's very dangerous. Moreover, all of history, as James Madison taught at the Constitutional Convention, shows that the instruments of power that are developed initially to counteract foreign danger customarily return domestically to suppress political dissent. We experienced that early on in our own history with the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. You cannot cabin legal theories and principles to foreign as opposed to domestic situation. And to give an example of that, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2011 is illustrative. You know that we've been told for many, many years that one of the reasons we need to be in Afghanistan fighting terrorists and evil thousands of miles away is because if we don't, the battlefield will be in the United States. We'll be fighting against the caliphate in Washington, D.C., and so we must project the military abroad. Now, with the National Defense Authorization Act, 10 years later, Senator Lindsey Graham, supported by Joe Lieberman and John McCain, amongst others, said we need the National Defense Authorization Act that empowers the President to pick up any of us in this room, anyone in the United States, and say on secret evidence, I think you may be substantially assisting an associated group with Al-Qaeda, whatever an associated group means, and therefore you're going to go to Guantanamo Bay and remain in indefinite detention until the war on terrorism ends, which means never, right? Since no one has even conceived of a benchmark that brings the war against international terrorism to an end. And in promoting this draconian authority, Lindsey Graham said, it's time to bring the battlefield here to the United States, Instead of being ridiculed, claps, cheers, it's like he won the Super Bowl or something, Truly astonishing. Bringing the battlefield to the United States of America? We're going to have laws of war, military. And then he also boasts, says, well, under this law, if we catch someone we suspect is a terrorist, you don't get to keep a lawyer here. You know, we get to treat you like you're a beast and vermin, just to Guantanamo Bay. As though that was an earmark of pride, you know, that we denied people lawyers, that we denied them due process. That's an earmark of our greatness. That's American exceptionalism. We don't do trials anymore here. I mean, it's truly stunning that this piece of legislation could pass. And the president would sign it. Think of the Stamp Act of 1765 that, you know, provoked the American Revolution. It was nothing, putting its, you know, 3 pence tax on imported tea. That's an example of how the instruments, legally and otherwise, developed purportedly to fight foreign danger, come back home to haunt us. Think about predator drones. You think they're going to remain outside the United States forever? No. It's a matter of time. We just have surveillance drones now in the United States. And that seems to be beyond the protections of the Fourth Amendment. Don't worry, there'll be predator drones soon as well. Just like the NGA took the authority to capture and detain indefinitely abroad and brought it into our own households. So this is why it makes a lot of difference to a country and maintaining liberty to have the line and the authority to go to war very strict and demanding. As Madison said, to repeat our father of the Constitution, liberty and permanent war are irreconcilable. Liberty and permanent war are irreconcilable. And that's where we are, ladies and gentlemen, today. No one has the leadership capability of standing up and saying the war is over. Sure, there's some risk. You can't live life without some risk. But it's not sufficient danger to our sovereignty to remain in a state of war, where the instruments, legal and otherwise, are so draconian and so hostile to freedom, free speech and otherwise. And despite the fact that the Constitution is about as clear as you can be with regard to the entrustment exclusively to Congress to authorize the initiation of war, not only is the language there, but the early precedents were the same. George Washington, who presided at the Constitutional Convention, was the first president, said only Congress can authorize the offensive use of the military. Thomas Jefferson had more than 10 statutes authorizing what you might call a semi-war against the Barbary pirates. 10 statutes. James Madison went to Congress to get authorization for the War of 1812. So those who were at the Constitutional Convention knew what it meant. And today, say, we've turned the clause on its head. Even think about the debates we have today. Should we go and bomb the nuclear facilities in Iran? Do we need to step up warfare with predator drones in Yemen? It's all assumes only the president decides. Congress doesn't even make a cameo appearance in the debate. No, it's unbelievable. And you read the stories, no one says, but the president doesn't have any authority to do this on his own. Where's Congress? Nowhere. And it shows you, ladies and gentlemen, how critical it is for a political culture to be mature if you're going to retain any semblance of a rule of law and democratic precepts. Language can only do so much. And we should know it from our own experience with Jim Crow. It didn't matter what the Civil War amendments meant. When the political culture was one of white supremacy, it didn't matter what the words meant, what the intent was. If you were black, you had no rights. You got lynched, your kids were kidnapped, you couldn't find a job, or anything else. Until the political culture changed. With the March on Selma, with the Civil Rights Movement, the sit-ins, Mississippi burning, people standing up and going down, we're going to register blacks to vote in the South, the law still was impotent to defeat political culture of racism and supremacy. And now we have a different fight against the political culture. I call it the psychology of empire in my book. American empire before the fall. You know, anything gets subordinated, make me safe. You know, we'll accept vassalage, make us safe. Even if it's not, even if it has an appearance of safety. Everyone accepts, you know, what is said to be needed in order to make us safe. And that means abandoning all checks and balances, abandoning separation of powers, abandoning the language of the Constitution, not bothering to amend it. Make me safe. Who cares about the law? After all, you know, this is a matter of life and death. It is life and death for posterity. So you have to preserve the law rather than to trash it, which is where we are at present. Now, what happened when President Obama proclaimed that he was omnipotent in decisions of war and peace? Well, he didn't quite say that. He said he would consult the Arab League from time to time, or the Security Council, anybody but the American people in Congress who actually has the money and the men and women who are going to go die, right? Nobody thought that that was rather strange. Well, Congress did not protest. American people certainly didn't protest. It was all just accepted. Hey, you know, we're an empire. You need somebody who controls things. You know? And there's no protest. And that's why, in some sense, we have a constitutional amendment without the amendment process. It's just amendment by decree, amendment by cultural changes and attitude, which is the opposite of the rule of law. At least we would have a mechanism, if we wanted to amend the Constitution, to endow the president with authority to go to war, to have a debate. Then you have to vote on it, you have to engage in discourse. Maybe such an amendment would be defeated, but at least it would be open and at least alert the American people to the importance of what was at stake, rather than just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, well, this sounds all right to me, the president says he'll make us safe, and Congress is dysfunctional, and therefore, you know, the Constitution doesn't mean what it says anymore.
Out of curiosity, what about the War Powers Resolution? I mean, doesn't that seem like Congress has ceded most of its authority in that area for that express purpose?
No, the War Powers Resolution, this is an act, this was passed during the Nixon administration. War Powers Resolution of 1973 was a response to Nixon's unilateral secret bombing of Cambodia, expanding the Vietnam War into Laos without congressional authorization. The first thing that it says is that in Section 8 that the resolution is not intended to alter the constitutional disposition of the power over war. So it declares it's not trying to change the Constitution, which immediately answers your question in a larger extent. Moreover, even if you accept, and then in Section 1, the Statement of Purposes of the War Powers Resolution, it says the President can use the military in 3 situations. 1, when Congress has declared war, and they say the military is, put the military in a situation of imminent danger to life or limb. 1, when Congress has declared war. 2nd, if Congress by statute maybe doesn't declare war but has specifically authorized the military venture. Or 3rd, in response to an actual attack on the United States, which the President always had that authority. Indeed, at the Constitutional Convention, in debating the war power of Congress, it was acknowledged by Madison that this wouldn't eliminate the President's power to repel an immediate attack. Because at that point, you don't need a declaration of war. If someone has attacked you at Pearl Harbor, you don't need it. You're already at war, because what the other side has done. Those are the 3 and only 3 authorizations that the War Power Resolution creates for the President to use the military offensively. And none of them applied, for example, to Libya. And the President said, so what? You know? And in fact, even in the violations, the War Powers Resolution also says that even in a situation where the President has initially properly used the military in hostilities, the President must return to Congress within 60 days with a statement of reasons why its military presence is needed to extend beyond 60 days, and then if Congress doesn't ratify or authorize extension beyond 60 days, the troops need to come back to the United States. Again, a provision totally violated with regard to Libya or all the other uses of the military in any event. So no, I've testified on why the war powers resolution is defective in many respects, because Congress should assert, in my judgment, a more muscular regulation of the President's ability to conduct war even after there's an authorization. For example, Congress should be deciding the ultimate disposition of what happens in Afghanistan after 2014 instead of the President doing by executive order. He could extend the war indefinitely. Congress should be making that decision. But the war powers resolution is not something that the President can rely upon, and does not represent an effort by Congress that they try to enforce to restrict the President's authority to initiate war unilaterally. And I say, who in the Congress at present standing up and denouncing Obama's statements about when he will or when he won't go in and bomb Iran? Because he said, open, it is not acceptable, and military means will be used for eliminating any nuclear capability of Iran. Where does he have the authority to make the statement?
Under our treaty power. The nuclear non-proliferation treaty requires the use of military force in response to a new nuclear state.
Well, the first answer to that is no, it doesn't. There's nothing in the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that authorizes the use of force. And then the second answer, even the larger answer, is the United States Supreme Court has, for over 40 years, has explicitly stated a treaty which does not involve the Congress, the House of Representatives, cannot override a constitutional provision. If we have a treaty with foreign countries to say, hey, everyone agrees you cannot criticize the government, it can't snuff out the First Amendment. So a treaty is impotent to change the constitutional entrustment exclusively of Congress to the Congress. So there isn't any authority by either the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or otherwise for the President to decide whether to attack Iran because he thinks they have a nuclear capability like Iraq's weapons of mass destruction or otherwise. And who would check whether they actually are accurate with regard to these statements of nuclear potential. Did you want to ask?
Yeah, I mean, don't you think that the passage of time would have made such a situation as that we face today almost inevitable? And even if it wasn't, couldn't you say that the development of technology over the past 30, I guess 50 years might be a more apt time here? Wouldn't you say that technology over the past 50 years has acted to accelerate this development?
No, I mean, remember that those who drafted the Constitution did not think that they were creating, a petrified forest for rules. And that's what Article 5 is about. They said things can change. Let's put an amendment process. Indeed, the very first act of the very first Congress was to propose the Bill of Rights. They didn't say, well, technology can change and we'll sort of invent new rules. They said, no, we have a process by which we need to change or accommodate if we think that the world has changed and we need accommodations, where we effectuate it consistent with the rule of law. And so if it's thought that we can no longer live with a Congress, I would disagree, but if it's thought that that's needed in an age of nuclear weapons and the internet and all sorts of other things, there's a legal way to do it. Propose an amendment, have a discussion, convince your neighbors that you're right, and vote. That's how we do elections. That's what the rule of law is. We don't just say, hey, somebody gets it in their head, we want to change the law. Okay, I'll do it my way. I don't need to convince anybody else, That's what the definition of tyranny is.
Right. Yeah, but people forget the Constitution consists of the history of mankind. Roman, Greek, Judo, Christian religion. People really don't understand that the Constitution was this brilliant idea of taking what you call natural law and incorporating it into American constitutional law. And I know more about the Constitution in ways where other people might not understand. The Constitution was actually built on how people get along, human nature.
Of course it's built on human nature. That's all enlightened institutions have to respond to human nature. And that's
right.
what and making the ordinary deductions what Hamlet calls the ordinary depravity of human nature.
Right.
And with that's exactly what the Constitution is about. And remember, what the history of liberty is a history of procedural safeguards. The Constitution, more than anything else, is a history and an enshrinement of procedural safeguards against error and wrongdoing. Procedure is everything. Due process itself is the most important idea in the history of civilization. It is the first recognition that a human being can get it wrong. You need to have trials. You need to have an impartial decision maker. Because every event and the evaluation of every event in all of life is multidimensional.
Right.
There's more than one way to look at things. And a predator drone killing people at a marriage ceremony in Kabul is different perceived by Afghans than people in San Francisco or Washington, D.C. or elsewhere.
Right.
Due process, hey, we need to have people from varying perspectives come give different evidences to an impartial judge before you decide. That's what, and the Constitution, in some sense, enshrines due process not only with regard to individual trials, but the whole idea of checks and balances and separation of powers is also an idea of due process. We need to have checks on the inclination of human beings to dominate for the sake of domination. We don't want one person to make that decision because we know absolute power corrupts. And that's why people say, well, Mr. Fein, it's just such a technicality they didn't do Article 5. A technicality, that's like calling a trial a technicality to justice. A trial is the definition of justice, you know?
Right.
How can you call it a technicality? It's a whole definition of who we are that says we're not communist China. Says we're not Russia. You know, we're not Hosni Mubarak's in Egypt. That's why we built our nation here. So we could have a different form of a republic where individual liberty was the center of our intellectual and philosophical universe, not just big government and building empires and dominating other people.
Right.
So never, in my judgment, it's one of the things that's, it's so, I don't know whether I call it silly, if not fatuous to say, well, the Constitution is outdated because they didn't have internet at the time, and they didn't have nuclear weapons at the time, and they didn't have, you know, Lady Gaga at the time, or Michael Jackson, or the Super Bowl. So, I mean, why are you looking at what men wrote hundreds of years ago? The old fogies, you know? It's like saying, you know, yeah, you know, why do you read the Bible? Why do you read Shakespeare? Why do you read Confucius? It's so old. They didn't know about the internet, so what do they have to say about life?
Because human nature never changes.
Yeah, no, the DNA in all of us never changes. Human nature doesn't change. Remember the passage from Ecclesiastes. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
There's nothing new under the sun. And anyway, that's why these procedural violations, to my mind, are so stunning and dangerous. Because it means we will be in perpetual warfare. You give the power to the president to go to war unilaterally, we're never going to get out of a state of war. We'll be in Syria, we'll be in Yemen, we'll be in Nigeria, and all the presidents do this because they know there'll be a blip in their popularity ratings. With times of warfare, everybody rallies behind the president. It's unpatriotic to criticize the president, and that's why people are in the White House, because they crave power. Yes?
What's the purpose in arming the Department of Homeland Security so heavily?
It's the same reason why we have the Department, the TSA, and all these other things. It is creating this illusion of safety. You know, we give them arms, we give them, and you give the police forces now the predator drones or the surveillance drones and all sorts of other weapons, and it makes it seem that the more you arm people, the more you give them the ability to kill and to maim, the safer you are. Instead of recognizing, no, the greatest safety is twofold. One, the loyalty and allegiance of people to their government, so they will volunteer if they see something suspicious. And second, not giving other people reasons why to hate you, like killing innocent people by dropping drones on them, or getting involved in their politics and saying, well, we want the transition to be in Yemen this way, and Syrians ought to act like this, and those in Egypt ought to act like that. And they get angry, because they act, why are we fiddling with their politics? One of the reasons why Iranians hate the United States, in some sense, the government, because they had their first elected Prime Minister Mossadegh overthrown by our CIA, installed the Shah, and then we ask, well, gee, we don't understand why they're so grateful that we helped them install the Shah. No, they resent that. And so when people try to reject this idea that we had any culpability in any way for 9/11, they're wrong. We're over in the Middle East propping up these oppressive dictators with money, military sales. We just sold the Saudis $30 billion. If you're a Saudi and you want freedom, they say, well, who's the bad guy? I mean, that Saudi Arabian government is getting this huge amount of money and military and other support from the United States. So we're giving other countries and people grievances. Most of the people, for example, in Afghanistan, they live within a 5-mile radius of where they are born. They don't even know, they think U.S. soldiers are Russians, you know. They can't even find the United States on a map, but they know that they don't like people who are killing their kids and their parents and their families. And we target people not based on any intelligence that shows you were involved in 9/11. It's, oh, if we think that you made a phone call to somebody who was Al-Qaeda, then you get vaporized. You know, you're now a militant. You know, you read in the newspapers or in your internet all these statements, oh, Predator drone, 12 militants killed. How do they know that they're militants? They don't do any after-action report and say, oh, he carrying card, you know, like the ACLU. We got a membership, Al-Qaeda. You know, member number 324, paid dues on blank, blank date, you know? So it's great. They just make this stuff up. They make it up. And why? Well, heck, we assume that they're militant, otherwise they wouldn't be near the people we were bombing, you know? They wouldn't have gotten in the way of our Predator drone unless they were guilty. And so our safety lies in not giving other people cause to hate the United States because we're fiddling in their affairs, and also inspiring the allegiance of the American people by making clear that their liberty, their opportunities, their endowments are first priority, not building a bigger government to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Yes?
Now that it's culturally accepted that the president can violate procedure, my question is, do you think Romney would be any different? And if not, how do we go about reversing this situation of complacency with violation of procedure?
Well, I mean, in some sense, the only answer is history is biography of what, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said. Now, I've drafted at least something, it's called House Resolution 107 for Congressman Walter Jones. We're trying to have a hearing on it in the summer. It basically, it's a mild provision. It simply says it's the sense of Congress that any president who initiates war without authorization from Congress has committed a high crime and misdemeanor and should be subject to impeachment. Yeah, but it's gotten support from many different places trying to get a hearing on the House Judiciary Committee. So you call Lamar Smith and say you want a hearing on that. You need to explore this executive power. But in some sense, well, what can be done? Other than exploring and communicating with Congress, because Congress is the culprit in the largest sense. It's, I call the invertebrate branch that doesn't want to do anything. Likes to be an inkblot and complain, but actually be accountable for anything. They run away from something of that sort. But all you can do is you need to get involved politically. Politics is not an option in a democracy. Democracy is a collective endeavor. If your eyes and ears aren't focused on government abuses, that endangers me, because that means they're more likely to escape detection. Same if I'm not involved. It's the one affirmative obligation you have that can't be imposed by law. It's just morality that I think John Stuart Mill neglects in his treatise on liberty. Because the system can't work without citizens policing and censoring government. People in power are not going to police themselves. You're asking a change in human nature. It is not going to happen. And only by force and fear they'll be voted out of office. Say, you need to do something. Will that dynamic be created where we can restore the republic? And you need to get involved politically. And that doesn't necessarily mean running for office, but it means being letters to the editor, writing columns, organizing groups, you know, being involved in campaigns. And not necessarily even involving a particular candidate, but issues. You know, only vote for someone who supports X, Y, Z. And if it's not done, I can guarantee we will go the same way of every single previous 72 empires. We will be destroyed by our own fault, by our own self-destruction.
The more I read, the more history of the United States, from Washington all the way down, a lot of presidents have used their power. Lincoln declared martial law. Roosevelt put the Japanese in the internment camps. I could cite numerous violations. Wilson didn't like people speaking German when in World War I.
We lost sauerkraut, went the same way of French fries.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. So if you look at history, the history of the country, it's not like it just happened today. It's been happening all along.
History
Well,
repeats itself.
It does, but let me explain why I think that examination, at least, isn't fully complete. The best articulation of what the American Republic was about was John Quincy Adams' July 4th, 1821 address to Congress when he was Secretary of State. And he captures the entire essence of what the American Republic's foreign policy was about. And he says, we don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We wish freedom and liberty survives and flourishes everywhere. We fight only to defend our own. And he explains why. He says, we could be dictatress of the world. He says, yeah, we could try to dominate the world. He says our policy would insidiously move from one of liberty and freedom to one of force and domination. And we would end up destroying ourselves. He says, the glory of a republic is liberty. The glory of empire is domination and control. He said, what the United States celebrated was the march of knowledge and wisdom, not the march of the foot soldier. And in our early years, I would say up until the Mexican-American War, we practiced restraint. We did not seek to intervene in Latin and Central America when it was all in eruption against the Portuguese and Spanish empires. We could have tried to meddle. We said, no, that's up. They have to fight for their own liberty and freedom. And we didn't declare war against the empires of the world at the time. There was the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Chinese Empire, and the Romanov Empire, the British Empire, Napoleonic Empire. Oh, these are terrible things out there, clash of civilization, let's go fight them all. Oh. Now, it could be said we didn't have really much capability as well, but we weren't trying to build an armed forces that could ever even exert the power of an empire. Indeed, half of the Federalist Papers, which you could style as the Bible of the Constitution, half of them were devoted to explaining why standing armies are terrible, and why it was so constructive for the Constitution to put all these barriers in, because they didn't want standing armies.
Right.
They didn't want, Colin Powell's army for Madeleine Albright say, Colin, why do we have this great armed forces? We're not going to use it to go bomb Bosnia and Kosovo. They didn't trust themselves. We don't want those armies standing around. And that's what, and I view the first major chink in our Republican armor came with this Folly manifest destiny that emerged around 1840 by a guy named Sullivan. He was a newspaperman. It was then picked up by our American politicians. Manifest destiny that preached God had endowed the United States with this mission to convert the world in the greatness of free enterprise and democracy, and it would be a tragedy if we kept these freedoms only to ourselves and didn't bring it to all the rest of mankind. Manifest to who? Destiny, I understand, but manifest? Manifest to all the people who are going to attack. And that was the first break from the idea of Quincy Adams, we don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Our glory is liberty, not domination. And the Mexican-American War was the first expression of that folly. Even somebody who was sanguinary as Ulysses Grant, who fought in the Mexican-American War, described it as the most unjust, unfair, tyrannical war, in history. It says it's just like the European monarchs. President Polk at the time lied in stating that an American soldier on American soil had been killed by a Mexican soldier. He lied about the boundaries. The two famous statesmen. John Quincy Adams was then in the Congress. Abraham Lincoln voted against the Mexican-American War. And we had the equivalent of our weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when Abraham Lincoln introduced what he called the spot resolutions. He insisted Polk identify in what spot of America was American blood shed, and of course Polk just shrugged it off and wouldn't respond. In fact, the Mexican-American War was the only occasion when the House, the Senate did not, the House of Representatives later declared the war unconstitutional. Voted to declare the war unconstitutional. The Senate didn't pass it, so it didn't go anyplace. But it's that idea, that creed of manifest destiny, was the intellectual, philosophical estrangement from the founding generation. And it all then goes to the Spanish-American War, and remember the Maine and the phony claims that the Spanish had blown up the warship, and Woodrow Wilson's lies about the Lusitania not having arms on it. Roosevelt himself lied about Nazi attacks on U.S. naval craft to try to provoke World War II before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And in some sense, this steady descent towards empire that's persisted now for over 100 years became very much accelerated, sort of put on steroids when the Soviet Union disintegrated and we didn't have any check on arrogance. We didn't have any check really on projecting our power everywhere in the world. Nobody could threaten our sovereignty no matter what. And that's when we became now totally absurdly involved in military endeavors in every nook and cranny in the world. So now, our national security budget, which approximates $1.2 trillion annually, that, and it's been said that our military would be hollowed out, hollowed out. That expenditure exceeds the military expenditures of the rest of the world combined. We get worried China's spending, 10% of our expenditures on military. Oh, China's the next rising power. South China Sea, got to do marine training in Darwin, Australia. We got to pivot from the Middle East now to China. Yes, this empire. You see anything that moves, that we may not be able to dictate to the whole world what we want it to do. Cause for the military to
where are our social studies and history teachers? I graduated high school in '67. I know I never heard any of this. I'm fairly well read, and a lot. You're right. A lot of this we've been lied to. But where's the education system in bringing this out?
No, but you can't expect, the education system won't bring it out, because the education system, like everything else, is built around ratifying, supporting the status quo, the existing powers that be. And that's why and even if you take a look at more modern, and I don't want to deny that, a museum that's now being constructed about 9/11. You think in that museum there'll be any showing of any of the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia, all the money, the arms, the despotism of the Saudis, all the money that were given ridiculously to Egypt, Israel, manipulating all of these foreign countries. And no, it'll be like, hey, some people woke up and they just hated the United States. They had a nightmare about the United States and they hated us because we were actually voting for elections. And that we have free speech. It's insane. Utterly and completely insane that it makes any sense that someone thousands of miles away would just wake up and say, I hate the United States, they can't even find us on a map. But that museum won't have anything like that. And people who go through the museum will think, oh, these people are just so bad. We have no idea why they would come over and want to attack us. But that is to say, a function of the educational system when it's run by the elites, the status quo will invariably prevail. No one wants to question, and even today, people stand up, oh, American exceptionalism. And the difference is, Romney has his view of American exceptionalism, and then when he criticizes Obama for not being sufficiently patriotic and touting American exception, Obama doesn't say, well, actually the DNA is the same everywhere. We, by the genius of the Founding Fathers, have checks and balances, but we can't walk around the world and say, oh, we're all angels and saints and you're all Mephistopheles and Lucifers or whatever. You know? And no, he says, well, I actually do believe in American exceptionalism, you know? And he stands up and he views the world, and I'm sure Romney does as well. Each week, you know, we have, in his mind, international votes. You know, like the NCAA has #1 rankings in basketball and football. Okay, no, U.S. stays #1. You know, he talks about more. We're #1. No, the world needs to know that we're back in it. You know, and I guess the rankings get say, you know, how many Predator drones, how many other people you killed, how many foreign countries you're dominating. You know, what's your GNP, what's your health insurance program, or something like that. You know, it's like international relations is like a football game. You know, that's what this is about. I mean, it's a trivialization of life. It's a trivialization of what a nation is supposed to be. Rankings, you know? Wow. Yeah.
So I'm curious, I mean, you seem to be advocating a pretty, you know, restrained view of the United States' role in world affairs, which makes a lot of sense. But in your book, you advocate a pretty radical isolationist view that says we should no longer participate in these institutions of international law.
No,
So,
that's not true at all. I'm not against you. If you want to have institutions, you need to have international organizations to regulate the airwaves and to regulate the airspace so people don't crash into each other. Those are obviously sensible things to have. You know, you have international global systems. You need to make sure that you know, one airwave isn't clashing with another. Planes don't hit each other. And it's not an isolationist view. It's saying our influence abroad can be most pronounced when it's the influence of example. When people would put democracy wall in Beijing because they love democracy. That's influence. It's not having our AK-47s or Predator drones on Tiananmen Square. And that's not isolationist at all. It's saying we understand that the most powerful influence we can have is by living a life that others want to emulate, voluntarily, not at the end of a bayonet. And it doesn't mean that we can't have cultural exchanges. I'm not wanting to dismantle our intelligence agencies either. We need to be alert if other people may attack us. But that's what it should be about, not getting intelligence so we can, you know, destroy the entire world. Yes, Jen.
You mentioned before about how the fall of the Soviet Union seemed to be one of the times about the last check on American arrogance. Don't you think it happened a little bit sooner than that, though? I mean, you look at the early 80s with the Iran-Contra thing. Congress passed a law saying they couldn't give the money anymore to them, and Reagan did it anyway.
Well, listen, there's similar examples. Listen, I'm not suggesting the trajectory doesn't have any eddies in it. I'm saying it created a more generic tendency. But sure, there were abuses. But I was involved. I was counsel on the Iran-Contra Congressional Committee. And remember, the Bolin Amendment, it provided at various times more or less money. But its restrictions were to the use by the CIA or any other intelligence agency of monies for the purposes of overthrowing the Sandinistas. And the National Security Agency, which was what Ollie North operated out of, isn't an intelligence agency, no? Who sits there? These are the Henry Kissingers and, you know, the heads of the Department of Justice, etc. It never applied to the Ollie Norths of the world, and no court ever said that it did apply. Now, it's not to say that you couldn't argue that the spirit of the amendment was violated, but I don't think that Congress can say that the President of the United States cannot use, if he wants to go and ask some other country, hey, in his diplomacy, why don't you give money to the Sandinistas, or to the resistance? That's his right as the president to ask other countries to do that.
Yeah, but you're not asking for money. You're giving guns in exchange for money. Wasn't happening to those sales that were authorized are part of the Bolin Amendment. You're talking about the sales of the missile parts. I'm getting into technicalities to Iran, and that money that Iran then paid for the military went to an account that was controlled by Ollie North that then funneled into the resistance. But the larger point is certainly correct in the sense that it wasn't just the disintegration of the Soviet Union that created this tendency toward executive aggrandizement. Say it began as far back as the Mexican-American War. It's just a matter of moving from adagio to allegro down the road to ruination is all it is. And And speed and matters of degree do count in real life. We come back to the idea, I want to go back to your question about, well, what do you do when you see the rottenness of the political system? And to say, there's no guarantee that anything that we do in this room, individually or collectively, can succeed. The first person who stood up in the history of the world and said slavery was rotten and evil, we probably don't even know who that person was. But we're glad somebody broached the idea, because it could be picked up in times that were more propitious. Just like the first people in the United States in Seneca Falls in 1848 said, you know, really women ought to have the right to vote. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the originators, they were dead behind them when the 19th Amendment was ratified. So there's no guarantee that anything that we can do, that we will see the fruits of in our lifetime. But we have to do it no matter what, because that's the only noble, virtuous way to devote our lives between ashes to ashes and dust to dust. And at least we know in the United States and by history, you know, how do you proceed? How do you change minds? Talking, speaking in your own life, using your professional talents in ways that influence the organs of power, that we know where they are. And other than that, it's all that we're endowed and capable of doing. But multiplied, things can change. I mean, I saw it. I was involved in the civil rights movement. My valedictorian speech was about Viola Liuzzo. She was just a housewife in Detroit, came down to register blacks in Mississippi, was assassinated by the Ku Klux Klan. And her actually, I was in the Justice Department when the department and the FBI paid millions of dollars to her survivors because the negligence, since there was an FBI spy in the Ku Klux Klan car that did nothing while they shot her in the head. But that one housewife, not individually but collectively with those who were marching with Martin Luther King, kids and teenagers who took the water hoses and the cattle prods, they changed life. They changed life. Even if at the time when they began, when Rosa Parks decided that, you know, she wasn't go to the back of the bus, did she know in 1956 that this would ignite a revolution? No. She just said, I don't care. I'm not going to be degraded anymore. Right. So that in some sense it's a hope that we have that it'll succeed. May not, but there isn't, to my mind, there isn't any other choice of what we need to do in our individual lives, seeing the country so degenerated from the lofty aspirations that were created at the time of the American Revolution. Yes?
This is sort of a two-part question. What role do you think that the internet will have in the trajectory of warfare? For example, with the Egyptian Revolution, you saw Americans, you know, regular citizens, posting Egyptian websites that were kind of getting at the revolutionary message. On the other hand, it was just revealed that Obama was unilaterally authorizing cyber warfare against Iran's nuclear. So on the one hand, it seems to empower the citizens against these forces that want to commit war against one another. On the other hand, it really allows the executive to pursue unilateral warfare.
Well, it does, but I mean, the president didn't need the internet to pursue unilateral warfare. He's doing it openly, without any archaeology, you know, far before then. Sent predator drones, missiles, troops. So he doesn't need the internet to hide his unilateral assertion of warfare. And I think that also, I think it's a mistake to try to calculate the future of the world and international relationships based upon technology, because underlying the motivations stay the same. You know, there's Arab Spring and Mubarak's gone, but right now it's very dicey whether Egypt's going to have anything like what we would associate with democracy and freedom or otherwise. I mean, the Mubarak verdict is a clear example of that. It's much, much easier to be opposed to something than to construct something that's superior. Anybody can burn down a barn. To build one is a much more difficult exercise here. And one of the things that I think is so flawed in our thinking, our education, is this ridiculous belief that, oh, if you're talking about life before the internet or before Facebook or something, you can't possibly be saying anything relevant. Instead of trying to teach philosophy, why are people motivated? Why do people crave power? Why do people get gratification out of dominating others? And what can we expect with regard to their honesty? And how do you need to put in checks and balances to prevent, you know, the worst angels of our, the worst devils of our nature from dominating the angels of our nature? and that requires a philosophy of life, a philosophy that we don't even address in our public school system anymore. I mean, to some degree, in my mind, the greatest philosophical inculcation and instruction that needs to be given is, why do we have government at all? The Founding Fathers said in the Declaration of Independence, the whole purpose of government, the exclusive purpose of government, is to secure unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, period. That's it. Not wars and empires and building spacecraft to go to the moon. And that left it so that the individual and liberty was the center of our constitutional universe. And then there's the counter view is, no, we're actually just a nation. Power, we got to be tough. And we have to be able to control the world. We have to make people safe, even if they don't want to be safe. Liberty then is marginalized, as opposed to just building up big government and craving safety in exchange for vassalage or serfdom to a big brother. And that's the in some sense, that's the most important philosophical issue to address, because it then directs virtually everything else government does by knowing what its purpose is. And we've strayed so far from what I thought the founding idea was, no, that this was the first time in the history of mankind when it was thought that government was other than an extension of the king or some omnipotent authority who was to rule everything. And to the extent individuals had any rights, it was because it was a taking away from an omnipotent government. That was Magna Carta. King John had all the power until Magna Carta said we don't quite have all of it. And our system was revolutionary in the sense that, no, now we said all power, the sovereignty is in the people. And the government has nothing unless we have given it away. And the purpose of government is not for the people to serve the king. It's for the government and rule of law to serve the people. And that's what's been lost in our discourse, political discourse. We think about drivel and redistricting and whether you should make X or Y campaign contributions. It's nothing. There would be no campaign contribution problem if the government wasn't doing a million things it shouldn't be doing. People give money because it's an investment, just like in Google or in Facebook or in U.S. Steel or General Motors. They give, oh, well, I'll get my Solyndra, or I'll get my crop subsidy, or get some bank bailout or whatever. That's why they're giving money. You stop the Congress from doing what they shouldn't be doing, you don't need any campaign reform. No one's going to throw their money in where there's not something in it for them. And that's where we have gone astray, because we don't teach the philosophy of government, which is the first question you have to ask when you decide whether government is doing the right thing or not. What's its purpose? And we have changed the purpose. I'm not sure whether it's through debate, just by osmosis, or unthinkingly, from one where the liberty of the individual is the center of our universe, and we stop talking about every day in the newspaper should be invading in Syria and Yemen and all these terrible things going around in the world. Yeah, all these terrible things are happening in the world forever. And one of the great things about the United States is if anybody in this room or anybody else wants to volunteer and fight for Syrian liberty or whatever, they can do that. You can be Mother Teresa, you can be Albert Schweitzer or whatever. You don't have the right to coerce the United States into paying money and sacrificing lives for somebody else's liberty. If you want to do it, hey, that's fine. The purpose of our government is to make our country a more perfect union and celebrate our values that are Republican values. And if other people would like to bring that elsewhere with force or otherwise, fine, you go volunteer that. And the reason why the Founding Fathers had enshrined these precepts wasn't because they were callous and indifferent to misery. No one stands up and is gratified and revels in the fact that someone's being shot in Syria. Of course that's not what happens. But it's a recognition, long-headed recognition, that the instruments of power that we would have to resort to in order to cure these evils would destroy ourselves. That in the process of trying to make the world better, we would end up destroying our own democracy. Because you cannot use force. You cannot project the military without having all the power go to the executive. Aside from the fact that our ability, anyone's ability to change a foreign culture, given all of the imponderables we know that make up ultimate political evolution, the likelihood of us changing anything for the better, even if our motives were totally benevolent, is really, really slim. Now let me give you this anecdote to show how easy it is to mistake other cultures that we're unaware of. In Afghanistan, it was thought in one remote village that our military and what they call provisional reconstruction teams were going to build a well right adjacent to the homes of many women who had to walk 2 miles for the well water. And after 6 months drilling the well, they said, well, they'll really love Americans. It was all filled in. They didn't understand. So they redug the well. They come back 6 months later, it's all filled in. Americans, they don't know what's going on. So they ask an American soldier, female, to go ask the Afghan women, do they know what's going on? They said, yeah, we don't want that well there. The chance to talk outside the realm of our husbands is at the well 2 miles away. We don't want that well there. You're destroying our social life. So what we thought was giving them some great boon, they said, "What are you? You're crazy, we want to get away from our husbands." But that's just an example of how difficult it is to know, even if your motives are pure, how to build something that's going to work in that particular culture.
But does making something difficult mean we shouldn't try?
If you want to try, that's up to you. Now, that doesn't, and you may want to do that. The government of the United States has no justification for coercing me or your money if I don't want to do it. And that's the difference between a single volunteer as opposed to the U.S. government.
If it's the government of the people, the American people decide that it's worth trying, does that not make it the government's initiative? If the government gets their power from the people and the American people all decide we do wish to intervene on behalf of the lives of these individuals, whether or not in the end it's going to be best, we know what we can do now.
Well, the argument that I would make is that the Constitution itself places limits on what the government can do. Even if every single American wanted it. If everyone here in the United States said, we don't want free speech anymore, let's make it a crime to criticize you or me or the government, it's illegal, even if everybody is for it. So the Constitution, while recognizing popular sovereignty in some respects, places limits on the folly, if you will, recognizing the whims and proneness of human nature to err, says now certain things you can't do at all. And one of the things that it can, in my judgment, the United States cannot do is exactly what you said. Use
rule of law, right?
Yeah, well, that's called rule of law. That's why we have a Constitution. And therefore, I would say you have to amend the Constitution if you want to add that as an authority for government, because you cannot find that particular purpose enshrined in Article 1, Section 8, which is the listing of congressional authority. Yes?
Well, through history, all these dictatorships try to take over the world. Napoleon, Nazi, Hitler, you name it, all these, Great Britain, you name the country, and they were always trying to take over the world and, put their stamp on some other country and tell everybody how to live. But nobody ever succeeded at it as of yet that I know of.
No, and they never will. All empires fail because ultimately people resent that.
That's exactly
right. That's human nature. It's hardly a new, unexpected phenomenon. People don't like other people telling them how they ought to live their lives.
Right.
And that's why I always said, when we think also about the so-called the Cold War, and how ridiculous I thought it was to be so worried that it would be a danger to us if the Soviet Union, you remember, it expanded into Eastern and Central Europe, and in violation of the so-called Yalta Accords, that there are no free elections in Poland or whatever. He said that was a disaster for the Soviet Union, because they were occupying all these countries that hated them. They didn't entrust any of their weapons to the countries. It cost them a staggering amount of money. When they went into Afghanistan, you think a single Polish soldier was fighting there? All it did is preoccupy the Soviet Union with putting down rebellions in Hungary, and then there were rebellions in Eastern Germany, and then there were rebellions in Poland. So it kept them occupied on doing things they couldn't attack us. And just like the Chinese, who were the first people when we left Vietnam who attacked Vietnam? It was communist China. And Vietnam then fought back at China. Today, we will look about our folly in Vietnam. We're now talking about having Cam Ranh Bay naval base that used to be occupied by the Soviet Union, now hosting American ships. And we had 56,000 people die to try to prevent North Vietnam from having a country that then controlled the South because it was a danger to the United States. And why is that? Because the Vietnamese hate the Chinese trying to control them. which is, historically going to be true. So all these efforts at empire build in the seeds of ruination. When the Roman Empire expanded into Gaul, and then had all the Vandals would guard their frontiers at the time, pretty soon the Vandals said, well, this is crazy. Why are we guarding? We just go march on Rome. We don't need to obey these people anymore. And that's when you had the sacking of Rome in 410 AD. So it's self-defeating, because it's human nature to resent somebody else coming in without your consent and telling you how you ought to live your life. Yeah.
I have two questions. First, what would you say to, I guess, some right-wing historians who look at past European colonial powers and say imperialism did good things like, spreading common law, building railways, modern medicine, schools? And second question, do you think the American empire will have any positive legacy, say, 100 years from now?
Okay, let's go. The European powers said they build railroads. That sounds like Mussolini making the trains run on time.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not sure whether that is an earmark of advance or retrogression if it comes from sacrificing all of your liberties. But what was something else they said? Oh, the common law. That the British brought the common law to these foreign locations. Now, of course, one of the places where the British occupied, and they fought 3 wars in Afghanistan. Now, if you could recite to me what's the common law in Afghanistan that's a legacy of the British?
Well, but if you look at, say, India or Canada or Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, they're all common law jurisdictions. Yes, I mean, I do not agree with those views, but I wonder what you would say to, apologist historians. And the second question was whether you think the American empire will have any positive,
Okay.
The American
now,
Empire. What are you talking about?
First of all, with regard to promoting rule of law, the best way to promote rule of law is by example. You don't need to force it. It's a little bit odd to tell someone, hey, you should follow us with rule of law because we have a gun at your head and you need to obey what we're telling you the law is, or otherwise we'll use force. It's sort of a contradiction in terms. And as I say, our greatest influence, the United States Constitution has been more followed in the history of the world than any other constitution. And it wasn't because we took it to Argentina and said you have to have it. It's because it thought it worked. And it was there and available, and we could urge it for consideration. And if common law is something that's useful, it's not, in my judgment, it doesn't mean that it wouldn't have had an influence, or the American rule of law, simply by example. You didn't need to have an occupying force in order to impose the system. Aside from the fact that, the remnants of the common law, because Britain also had common law they brought to Zimbabwe and South Africa, apartheid. So the record is rather mixed, if not worse. And moreover, it doesn't show that you couldn't have an influence on legal regimes by having your own model than by occupying the country. What about the United States and our influence abroad? 100 years from now, I think that we will be viewed by those who are writing history the same way, we would view the Roman Empire. I think the limitations are going to be enormous. I mean, one of the things that's really strange, if not Orwellian, is right now there's big worry in Afghanistan that they don't have any system of preventive detention like Guantanamo Bay. So we're worried that if we take our current prisoners that are supposed to be transferred to Afghan custody over there, they'll have to release them because we don't have any evidence they committed crimes. So we're working with them to have a system of detention without trial. And what do you think that our system of predator drones does? Where without any serious, reliable evidence, we just vaporize people if we think that, that's connected to Al-Qaeda. They don't have to be threatening the United States or otherwise. That is an example that tells all the rest of the world, might makes right. You got enough power, you just decide what you want the law to be, invade other people's sovereignty. That's a pretty sad legacy to leave. And it's just a matter of time when other countries will say, all right, we'll just follow the United States model. which is if we can get away with it and we have enough power, we'll go ahead and invade any country we want and call them their threat to our internal stability. And think of this, if you want to show how I think dramatically the United States has adopted what we formerly criticized as earmarks of tyranny. In 2007, there was a Russian exile in London. His name was Litvinenko, who criticized very harshly Vladimir Putin. Putin said he's a danger to Russian stability. And there was poisoning of Mr. Litvinenko. It was called polonium-211. And he died, and the culprit was indicted, but he's back, and Putin says, oh, well, so what, the Russians weren't going to touch this guy. He was actually saving, you know, the Russians from the likes of Khodorkovsky and these people who have total dislike for what Putin was doing. And we denounced that. We said, this is terrible. This is the Russians trying to assassinate the people who are dissidents and want to change things at home and create demonstrations in Moscow. How's that any different than what we're doing? You know, we just go and we find somebody who say, well, we think you're a threat. Well, do we have a trial? No. Well, why do you think you're a threat? Well, we intercepted a phone conversation and said you didn't like the United States. Okay, well, you get vaporized. I mean, how was Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son, who was vaporized by a Predator drone while he was going to dinner in South Yemen, how is he a threat to the United States? We didn't even apologize for vaporizing. So our legacy is going to be one that encourages, in my judgment, you know, international lawlessness and might makes right. We, at one time, were the one country in the world that at least sought to celebrate due process as the earmark of our distinctiveness as a nation. And we were the model that other countries followed. But it's not, we don't want other countries to follow us by building their own empires and tyrannies. And we have set all the precedents to do precisely that. Yes?
Well, as Milton Friedman once remarked, there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. And as you can see, like all these examples you cited, like these crises throughout history just build off of each other. Like World War I, we expanded with the central planning, the draft, that came back in World War II. Now modern day, we got the Patriot Act, the TSA. But last year, they tried to debate the Patriot Act again, but it got reauthorized, and we have a president who campaigned against it, again signed it back into law. So, I mean, to me, it looks pretty bleak that you could actually really turn back the clock on these types of issues, unless you get another 300 Ron Pauls in Congress. But I mean, that seems to be. We talked a lot about the nature of human nature, but that's also the nature of government, is to metastasize and try to grow out of the limits imposed upon by the Constitution.
Well, I mean, that's right, and that's why, but the Constitution was built upon those premises, and that's why they had checks and balances and wanted and thought that Congress would actually be a check on the presidency rather than become a cheerleader. And part of what the Founding Fathers didn't perceive was the development of the party system that made those in Congress more partisan and just a champion of whoever was in the White House if that was their own political ilk rather than defending their institutional prerogatives. So both parties then participated in the slow emasculation of congressional authority by saying, well, if there's a Democrat in the White House being criticizing, we'll let him do whatever he wants. And then when there's a Republican in the White House, the Republicans say the same thing. And all the time, the power of Congress dwindles into virtual nothingness. Right. But you're right in the sense that, sure, these issues really are human nature, power for the sake of power. We just have this juvenile thrill that we get from dominating others. You know, I'm bullied on the playground, and I realize my self-identity is just have enough authority to tell other people how to live their life. You've all encountered busybodies like that, you know, and you ordinarily expect them to grow out of that phase when they're 15 or 16. But now we have people who are 50 and 60 who are still living that mentality in government power. And it's much more dangerous than just being a bully on the playground, because they got a whole lot of weapons and money and other instruments of coercion. But I'm saying, the only way that things can be changed is not by trying to change human nature, but to restore respect and honor in following rather than impairing the Constitution. And the second thing, as I call about, we need to develop a culture that prizes and celebrates and honors leadership. Now, what I mean by leadership is not, hey, I can get elected and I know how to get on a campaign ballot. I define leadership as the ability to inspire ordinary people to follow the better angels of their nature. It's way above politics. inspiring ordinary people to follow the better angels of their nature. Because it is true that human nature can be very complex and imponderable. Even the most introspective person oftentimes has difficulty knowing exactly why they're doing certain things. And it takes the George Washingtons or Abraham Lincolns, by impeccable character and devotion not to their vanity but to a larger public good, to encourage other people to be other than just selfish and vanity and absorbed with vanity and self-promotion. And we don't have that anymore in the United States. You look at our circle of political leaders and it's just all politics. Hey, it's the power, it's the money, it's the glitter, that's it. You know, there's nothing higher than, no higher principle that drives what they do. And people aren't stupid, they can see that. You don't need high IQ when you know someone's out for their own good. Maybe other than Mitt Romney, who maybe has an illusion that Donald Trump is doing things other than because he wants to promote Donald Trump, so he stands next to him. Just a disgrace of his ability to character judgment. But that's what leaders, and we have lost leadership. We have lost leadership in the United States, so that people grow up thinking, well, if all these other people are out there for their own good, you know, the banks, the TARP money, the bailouts, everything else, why should I act any different? Why should I make a sacrifice when I'm just being played for a dupe? I'm not saying that there are no exceptions, but we're talking about the large numbers that drive the trajectory of any nation. And without leadership, countries will go into ruination out of selfishness. They will not do anything other than, well, what's in it for me? And that is an explanation in part why, if we think about the glue that holds the country and the rule of law together, that glue is the willingness of people, without getting paid anything, to call to public account wrongs of government. To go and spend time in politics without getting paid for it. Because you don't have clients, you know. You don't get, I can guarantee you, having been involved in every impeachment of presidents since Nixon, you don't get clients for impeaching the president, you know. You don't get retainers. You're there for one reason. You think it's, hey, this is what the country and the rule of law demands. And those kinds of devotion, it doesn't respond to market forces. You know, there's no dollar-cent sign unless there's a true spirit and, in some sense, a reward that the society gives for this kind of contribution, the unaccounted for contribution to the rule of law. The rule of law is not something you buy. It's just in people's head and how they think that they must behave in order to have the country stable. It doesn't get compensated because the rewards are shared by everybody. And therefore, no one typically has enough stake in it to put in lots of money. Unless others are willing to just do it voluntarily, it doesn't happen. And the only way you get a culture, in my judgment, that is willing and voluntarily to put in those kinds of citizen obligations that keep the rule of law intact is through leadership. People inspire them, hey, you know, life is more than Lady Gaga and getting all sorts of money and lipstick and going to space and spacecraft and building, Trump towers. Now, this is what the Greeks would have thought is the trivialization of life. The serious part of life, adult life, is philosophy. Why am I here? What's the country here? Between ashes to ashes and dust to dust, what should I do that really matters? Other than survive for the sake of survival. Because any animal and species wants to survive for the sake of survival. And that is a kind of culture that's cultivated by true leaders. We don't have that in the United States. And that's where we need to try to encourage people to become involved, develop a culture that doesn't have to give them economic rewards. But the thinker should be more devoted and heralded in the United States and a poster of Shakespeare than Bruce Springsteen. Even if he's a great singer, so what? And until you can start walking into homes and seeing posters of Aristotle or whatever, as Socrates, as opposed to moral wretches or vacuousness, it's a real problem of how long the United States will survive as a country worthy of greatness. I want to go on now. You can ask. I want to continue because I think the war issue and some of these other issues really are the tip of the iceberg, and to convey how deep I think the flouting of the Constitution is. And it's become so routinized that it hardly even makes a blip, you know, in the newspaper stories. And let's focus a little bit on, I want to go into some detail to show you, you know, what is the distinction of the United States compared to other countries that we decide are totally tyrannical, on how the President of the United States makes the decision that he should put somebody on the kill list, which we think ought to be the one list that should be most safeguarded by procedural protections against error. If you're going to kill somebody, you should have a really high level of confidence you have the right person, right? Even in the United States, if it's an ordinary trial, we require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, even to find someone guilty of drunk driving. Now, if you're going to kill somebody, you should have a really, really strong measure of certainty that you're getting the right person. We do not, first of all, remember that the President is asserting this kill list authority without any foundation in congressional statute. The only congressional law that arguably would apply would be the authorization to use military force passed shortly after 9/11 that justified our initial invasion of Afghanistan. But the authorization to use military force defines the universe of people that the President can target as those complicit in the 9/11 attacks or those who harbored the persons complicit in the 9/11 attacks. Now, we haven't even killed a single member of Al-Qaeda, according to our own intelligence people, in Afghanistan for the last 18 months. There isn't anybody in Al-Qaeda who's there anymore. You know? They're all in Pakistan or otherwise. For 18 months. So the President is putting people on kill lists without any congressional authority. So you ask, well, how can he do this? Where is the law that justifies his vaporizing people? He's also putting them on the kill list even when they have not been indicted, charged with any violation of United States law. Osama bin Laden, at the time of his death, at least he was under indictment for, issued by a grand jury for conspiring to destroy defense establishments, etc. He was under indictment. Mr. al-Awlaki, who was vaporized not long ago in Yemen, he wasn't accused of anything at the time the President killed him. Not charged with anything. Now, John Yoo, who I debate annually at the National Defense College, says, well, but he was linked to Fort Hood massacre because the culprit there had listened to some of his lectures. And I said, yeah, but, you know, linkage, at least to my knowledge, is not a crime. You actually, if you want to make something a crime, you've got to write it into the statute, and I think it would be dubious to say because you're linked to somebody else, you've committed a crime. That smacks of guilt by association, which we thought went out with Magna Carta in 1215. So, the President sits in the Oval Office, and he says he's acting in the manner of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, first thing that comes to your mind, I'm sure if you read their memoirs or Summa Theologica, you never read about having hit lists for killing. I did remember about that in the Mikado. You remember I've got a little list, the King's High Executioner there, but not St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine. So, the intelligence comes in and they develop the hit list based upon the fact that somebody, one source, anonymous, may have said somebody is connected to Al-Qaeda. Doesn't mean that they've actually tried to kill any American. Doesn't mean that they've actually destroyed any American property, but okay, Al-Qaeda. Now, you can remember in the place like Afghanistan, where, in Pakistan too, where you have tribal ethnic differences that are very intense, people can report all the time false information because they want to get retribution against somebody they may have falling out over wives or daughters or land disputes or commercial disputes, or etc. But most of the time it's based upon communications. They intercept signals intelligence. Now, the communications are largely in Afghan or languages that the United States doesn't understand. And then, so that's how initially you may get on the hit list. So we intercepted a phone conversation. Not only anything that you said, but if you talk to somebody who somebody is thought to be Al-Qaeda, then you're also on the hit list. And then they develop, this is what their algorithm is for expanding the list. It's assumed that Al-Qaeda is the most paranoid organization in the history of the world. And because of their paranoia, they would never let anyone within 50 yards of a true Al-Qaeda unless they were sympathizers. And therefore, anybody who falls within a 50-yard radius and is a male over 18 is viewed, you must be Al-Qaeda, because they're paranoid and they never let you get close to them unless you're Al-Qaeda. Now, can you imagine taking that evidence into a courtroom, telling them, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, convict someone as Al-Qaeda. Heck, he was within 50 yards of so-and-so, and Al-Qaeda is paranoid. I'm not sure of whether they've had psychiatrists go into Al-Qaeda or they examine him at Guantanamo Bay and say, oh, you guys are more paranoid than even Joe Stalin was at the time of liquidating all of his enemies in the Soviet Union. Now, it is true that they say if there's posthumous intelligence that clearly exonerates you from being Al-Qaeda, then you're no longer a militant. So after you've been killed, if they come in and do more intelligence and find you're innocent, then, okay, they'll not list you as Al-Qaeda. And even the State Department was ridiculing the CIA's assessment, saying, yeah, if they see 3 people simultaneously doing jumping jacks, they assume it must be a terrorist training camp. Now, this is staggering. This is people getting killed based on this kind of evidence and information. And so when we wonder, well, why the Afghans and the Pakistanis don't like us? We're coming in to do such angelic things. They should view us as saints.
Right.
We're bringing them rule of law. We're liberating all of their women. We're showing them how much privacy we care about. And we're bringing them democracy. They view this as a joke, a cruel joke. And so, of course, they fight back, largely because we're trying to kill them. And then when they fight back, what's our response? We need to stay there because they're trying to kill us. This is like someone attacks you, so in self-defense you stand up and fight back and say, now you've really given me reason to kill you because you're trying to kill me. Yeah, in self-defense. And this is a kill list. This is the United States of America, ladies and gentlemen. This is us. We are, in some sense, culpable. It's our government. They represent us. They're making us less safe. This is not acceptable. And no cries for impeachment, no cries for prosecutions, no congressional hearings, nothing. If anything, people stand up and applaud, oh yeah, just use the Predator drones, it's an antiseptic way to kill people. And it gets even more Orwellian. And to show you how much power corrupts, I'll do a little anecdote. Harold Coe was, for long years, Dean of Yale Law School. And at one time, during the Clinton administration, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. I remember testifying with Harold Coe on the panel for a Senate Judiciary Committee in 2006 denouncing the Military Commissions Act, which authorized some of the more horrendous detention without trial authorities used at Guantanamo Bay. And there was Harold Coe. I don't think he was sitting next to me, maybe 2 seats away. Now Harold Coe is now the legal advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He's defending all the things that President Obama is doing. And he testified not long ago for the House and Senate Foreign Relations Committee that our conflict, our use of force in Libya was not a war. We said, and it didn't involve us in hostilities. And the reason why our killing in Libya wasn't hostilities is that nothing we were doing were endangering U.S. lives. We are dropping bombs from very, very high altitude, and the Libyans at that time didn't have any anti-aircraft mechanism to endanger our pilots, and therefore a war, killing without hostilities. Therefore, War Powers Resolution didn't apply. No law applied to restrain what the president can do. Well, it's rather strange. So we could then, under his theory, launch nuclear-tipped ICBMs from the United States kill every living, breathing thing in Libya, no hostilities. And the U.S. wasn't in danger. If we could blow up the whole world without engaging in hostilities or war. Wow! And we thought 1984 was an exaggeration of George Orwell? Ministry of War is the Ministry of Peace? No. Nuclear weapons and ICBMs are not warfare anymore. I said, Harold Cope, what happened? What happened to all your human rights and denunciations of unlimited executive power? Now you're the legal advisor to the Secretary of State and you make such nonsensical statements. And it shows you how far our political culture has gone. That, and how easy it is for absolute power to corrupt. You remember, all the things that Obama is doing, that we've chronicled only partially here, are things that he denounced when he was running for office. He said, oh, we're going to shut down Guantanamo Bay. He said presidents can't go to war without authorization from Congress, can't have state secrets, we've got to be transparent about everything. And he gets into office and he does exactly the opposite.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that's because when he's actually faced with the situation, the decisions are harder than he thought they would be? Or do you think that his actual like principles have changed?
Well, you're assuming that he had any principles at all.
So do you think that it was more of a facade of what he was saying before entering office?
Yes, and I have a chapter in my book called The Bush-Cheney-Obama Triumvirate, because it's a philosophy that transcends party. It's the entire culture is imbued with these ideas. And he gets into office, and I don't think that and he's not somebody who's ever spent serious time thinking about these issues. I mean, I was a little bit before Obama at Harvard Law School and Gannett House and the other things. And I can tell you, in law school is a trade school, even at the Harvards and the Yales. They teach you how to win lawsuits. You don't have courses on war powers, because you don't get clients. So they don't focus on anything unless you get clients. And so Obama comes to the White House. He'd been in the Senate a couple years. Before that, he was out in Chicago. Say, I went to Washington right after law school, clerkship. Then I was in Office of Legal Counsel, was working in the Department of Justice. I've been there 45 years, and it takes a while of seasoning to understand the real viciousness of power. The first time you go to the White House, you see the presidential matches. The first time you go out to the CIA building in Langley, the truth, know the truth, and it shall make you free. And you go in and you're just totally awed, because you've never been exposed to these national security matters before. You read about them, in books. You read about John McCone and Allen Dulles and overthrowing governments, and wow, this really must be the wizards of the world. And you've got to be there a while to see through the phoniness of it all. Because if you have any humility, you're not likely to walk into some novel situation and say, oh, I know better than these people. They've been around long years. And you got life and death at stake. So Obama came in totally naive about this stuff. And he gets just bowled over by the military and national security people. And sees, oh, wow, you tell me these things. I believe it. It must be a really, really dangerous world out there. And it takes a little bit of courage to go against the grain. Because remember this, in politics, the great, great game is to always have an excuse other than yourself for why things went wrong. So Obama knows, if I tell these people, they don't know what the heck they're talking about, we're pulling out. And it goes wrong, because there's always a risk of something going wrong. The world is too imponderable to know exactly what your actions are going to accomplish. Then I'll just, oh, how could you, naive, you didn't serve in the military, how could you go against the military people who've been on the battlefield and whatever? Okay, so what's the least risky thing to do? Hey, I'll just do exactly what they tell me to do. Then I'll just say I just followed my advisors, right? And that's what Mitt Romney says. Everybody says that. Oh, I'll do what my military advisors tell me to do in Afghanistan or whatever. It's like the French. Well, my military says the Maginot Line will prevent all the Nazis from killing us, so, well, we'll stick with the Maginot Line. It doesn't matter how stupid or crazy this stuff is. They'll always have somebody else to blame. It won't be them. So Obama comes in, so he just follows, he just does everything that all the military people say, okay, do X, do Y, do Z, we need to stay in there. No one wants to get out of Afghanistan for a simple reason. because it'll show the stupidity of all this 10 years of warfare accomplished nothing. And then they're going to have to go back to parents and kids and wives and spouses and say, why'd my son or daughter die? I don't know. There's nothing changed there. It's a corrupt government like it's been all along, faction driven, and it's got opium production more than when we went in. And Obama doesn't have the moral and intellectual authority to tell him, that's nonsense. I'm going to do X. So he just continues on what Bush Cheney did. If anything, it's even more aggressive than Bush and Cheney, because I think he needs to overcome the obvious worry, well, he's going to be soft and he's not going to show the right level of obedience to American exceptionalism and that kind of thing. I mean, just think, he's now presiding over a government that now views China as the, I mean, at least he's beyond Russia, which is Mitt Romney's, fixation. Russia's about ready to take us over. And man, I'm sure everyone in this room shakes with terror if Russia takes over South Ossetia, or Abkhazia. You know that we would be next. John McCain would want to go to war, and maybe Mitt Romney would be too. But this idea that all these resources are going to go to provoke China into some kind of conflict over the South China Sea and over all these other things that have no security element to us whatsoever. This is Barack Obama. This is the irony. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's probably been one who's conducted more wars than any single figure in the history of the world. This gentleman.
So, since Bush did this stuff too, was Bush naive too, or was he just stupid?
Was Bush what?
Was Bush naive as well then, or was Bush just stupid? Because you said it was stupidity, so...
No, well, I'm saying that it's stupidity, not necessarily politically stupid. It's self-destruction is what it is. But that's something that's built into those who don't understand that if you have a craving for domination and control, ultimately it will come back and haunt you. It's just like Macbeth was too dumb to realize, even though he knew it, when Lady Macbeth said, kill Duncan, he says, yeah, murder is a double-edged sword. It will come back and haunt me. But he did it anyway, because the inability to restrain his human craving for that moment to acquire kingship. Or Napoleon probably knew when he burned Moscow it was the death knell, but he would do it anyway, show momentarily he got a thrill or something out of showing how strong and powerful he was. Now Bush comes into this, and I say he's building on the same tradition of, Clinton without authorization to go to war. He goes in Bosnia and Kosovo, and he's the one who signed the 1996 Anti-Terrorism Act, which created the initial splurge towards all these extravagant powers. But surely you're true in the sense that Bush's IQ is a fraction of what Obama's was, but his policies weren't all that different. I had to know somebody who was in the White House with Bush and said, with regard to Iraq, and all the memoirs say that they don't have any idea why we actually invaded Iraq, is that Bush was there because it was revenge because Saddam tried to kill his dad at one visit over there. And once we caught Saddam, he became disinterested in Iraq, didn't care anymore. But that's how petty and how willing he was to risk American lives for something that insubstantial. And he figured, well, listen, we got the military power to do it, so let's go ahead. And then when you think about our totally paranoid feeling towards Iran, one of the reasons why Iran is as powerful as they are, because we destroyed Iraq as the big check against Iran. Because Saddam said in his confessions after we captured him is the reason why he made up these ideas that he had WMD is because he's worried about an Iranian invasion, not the United States. And so we go ahead for the benefit of the mullahs and destroy the only check against them. How's that for a great wisdom, So that the president can get some revenge for an attack on his daddy. Wow. Anyway, with regard to the overall problem that we confront as a nation, it's not really personalities is what we get involved in. Is it Obama or Bush or Cheney, whatever? It's the entire political culture that has degenerated into at least acquiescing in, or at least being complacent with acting like an empire and finding reasons to intervene everywhere in the world. I mean, didn't anyone stand up and almost get perplexed when we read, yeah, the CIA is helping fight the Lord's Resistance Army in Central Africa. You know? We're worried about, you know, bad guys if people want to volunteer. What is our national security interest? Why do we have the CIA over there? You're probably creating more problems, and why are you here in Africa? And probably will expand to some other country. You know, there's a teenager who joined Al-Qaeda of the Maghreb in Niger, so we'll send the military there. No, nothing moves that we don't send the military in. And it isn't just the military, what it betrays is this idea of who we are and why we exist as a nation and a government that's most alarming. Is this all we are about? Just flexing muscles and forcing people at the point of a gun, you know, to do what we tell them to do? Or are we focused on liberty and trying to ensure, because we've got plenty of problems here at home, that we try to guarantee a fair opportunity for everyone to succeed. We don't view politics like a football or a baseball game. Somebody wins and loses. Everybody is hope. We want to make everybody win in a healthy political system. We don't want to be gleeful about anybody losing. Now, some of it, you know, we give them fair opportunity, want them, and urge them to succeed, but we are not jealous about them. That's the kind of culture we want to promote. We want to promote, you know, personal integrity, accountability, austerity. We want to reward and celebrate socially those who have minds and think and have high character, and marginalize people who think all life is jumping up and down and having glitter and appealing to people's basest instincts. And that takes serious amount of intellectual and moral effort and psychology and leadership. And we can't be dissipating this very hard struggle that we all have within ourselves. Why are we here? How can we live a life of virtue? Something we all ask, because we're all human. And we're wasting time and distracting ourselves by worrying about whether the Syrians are going to have some government that's free or whatever, that we have no control over as our own society morally rots. That's just wrong. And the only way it's going to change is for people that are in this room and otherwise live lives that don't succumb to the temptations of the internet age or the cyberspace age or whatever, and focus on the realities, the fundamentals of what a philosophically honorable life is about.
What are your thoughts on what the financial consequences of empire will be on the military, and then as well as maybe the military consequences on the finances going forward?
Yeah. Well, the military consequences on the finances are horrendous. I mean, when you're running a budget deficit of over $1.2 trillion already, and the military budget is $1.2 trillion, that's just not sustainable. You can't be spending that amount of money. And if anything, that probably understates the total financial drain. Because all these kids, men and women coming back from Afghanistan, Iraq, they have post-traumatic stress. We're going to be treating these people psychologically for 50 or 60 years. And we haven't even calculated that into the budget. And many of these people are, you know, imbalanced because they see there's no reason why they're there. I talked to countless parents. They said, my kid writes back, says, this is pointless. They doesn't even know why they're there. They're guarding opium fields. You know? There's no policy. So they don't feel like they're doing anything that counts and that matters. And that's just, it's not sustainable to run these huge deficits. $16 trillion deficit, national debt. You know, it's staggering tens of thousands of dollars for every American before it even starts to pay off anything, and it keeps rising year by year. And I mean, to that degree, the ability to project ourselves militarily will, at some point, collapse because the economy, the inflation, and everything else will become so decrepit it can't sustain itself. I mean, and that was similarly what happened in the Soviet Union. When Gorbachev explains, you know, what happened when the Berlin Wall finally fell, was that the East Germans were all getting to the West by going through Hungary. And Hungary no longer had the finances to even keep up a fence that would prevent the evasion of the wall by going through Hungary and then Austria. And Gorbachev goes to the Hungarian Prime Minister and says, well, what do you need to repair the wall, or the fence? $3 billion. Gorbachev says, we can't afford that. He says, the hell with it, just go ahead and leave it. You know? So then the Soviet Union couldn't afford all that staggering expense of empire. And we're not going to be able to sustain with all these hundreds, thousands of bases abroad for much longer anyway. And you're seeing the crunch right now where, supposedly, if there's no agreement on the budget between the Democrats and the Republicans, the military budget is supposed to lose $600 billion with $600 billion on the domestic side by an automatic sequester in early 2013. People are already hauling out the military. Now, probably what will happen, given politics, is both the Democrats and Republicans will say, all right, let's push back another 15 years when the cuts will occur. Because they flinch ordinarily when the time for accountability comes and leaves it to the next generation to deal with the problem. That's what we call profiling courage.
I'm not quite convinced that the interventionist foreign policy is completely mindless, because you see oil in Libya and Iraq, and also they found oil in Uganda.
Yeah.
Do you think the invasion of Iraq could have more to do with a scramble for resources than, about Bush's dad being attacked?
Well, let me address, I think, the fundamental core of your question, which is that the idea is that if you project yourself, you may need to project yourself militarily in order to secure access to resources. That, I believe, is totally and completely fallacious. The fact is, at far less expense, you can bribe anybody to sell you anything you want ever, which is why boycotts never work. And you can bribe people in China to sell you rare metals, earth metals. And the bribery doesn't cost half as much as deploying thousands of troops there to open the Straits of Hormuz. And that is the history of every boycott that has ever been attempted in the history of mankind. We got a boycott on Castro in Cuba. It's been around for over 40 years. And, well, what happens? Well, everybody else sells them whatever we won't want to sell them. And that's the same thing with regard to Iran. Oh, well, we have all these jams, and if we don't sell it, then China will, or they build up dummy companies, and it ends up there anyway. When Jimmy Carter imposed an embargo, wheat embargo on the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan, Argentina and Spain quintupled their wheat purchases from the U.S. and resold it to the United States. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Arab OPEC members said embargo on oil to the United States and Netherlands because we so heavily supported Israel. And everybody, even Henry Kissinger, writes, no, it had no effect on the United States. We just bought it from middlemen. They sold it to somebody who resold it to the United States. So the idea that it makes any sense to project the military to secure natural resources is totally misplaced and has never worked, and otherwise has been a total disaster at all times and all places. Aside from the fact that in Iraq, the oil production diminished after we invaded. It didn't climb. Now it's climbed a little bit after we've gone. And think of this. If we permitted it, Iran would sell us all the oil we would want directly. Hugo Chavez sells us every drop of oil he's got. Nothing is more idiotic than the idea, oh, we need the military to get access to these valuable resources. Hey, you know what? You just put out the money and pay for it. There's a seller if there's a buyer. We have, in an analogous situation, look at the idea that we put in $1 trillion or more to stop the international drug trafficking trade. Say, okay, we're really going to impose an embargo on illegal narcotics. And what does it produce? Nothing. If we got buyers, if there's a demand side of the United States, hey, we're going to get access to it. We can put all the embargoes and criminal penalties in the world. It's going to happen.
It's true.
Yes?
So do you see the fall of the American empire being financial ruin or something else?
Well, I think it's a combination of a financial ruination plus it's the destruction of liberty, the destruction of the idea that our individual freedom is what the government is about, not just bailing out everybody and subsidizing everything that moves and running around the world and by force of arms trying to control other people's destiny. And that by itself is in some sense, will be the ruination of what I would call an open system of government with checks and balances. We will have, if unless things change, probably, whether it's in my lifetime or yours, we'll soon have a government where the president rules by decree, and Congress will be simply ornamental, and that's hugely dangerous in my judgment. The government will grow bigger and bigger, and we'll have surveillance drones, and it'll look like George Orwell's 1984 with some, variations of the scenery.
Do you not think that there's a point where the legislature would try to take back some of their power?
Not so long as the partisanship remains, and I don't see partisanship, if anything, it's strengthening, becoming more rather than less acute. I know I'm up in Congress 3 or 4 times a week. There's no summer for that.
Do you think that political culture will change as sort of like the last generation of those who went through World War II are gone? Because I feel like World War II, doesn't that have like some sort of a starting point, the end of World War II, that culture has sort of a starting point in your, what you say is the current political culture of the American Empire?
No, because I think the deterioration in the culture began as far back as the Mexican-American War with Manifest Destiny, because it was casting aside the idea that the glory of the Republic was liberty, and began to say, no, the glory of our country is domination and control. I mean, I don't know how many people I talk to, well, Mr. Fein, we just wouldn't be the United States unless we were all over the world. We'd be like Uruguay. It's just because we're so brought up from the day we're born into thinking, yeah, hey, the United States is just everywhere. We're sort of number one. And when we're childish and naive, we sort of accept that. We don't understand the folly of viewing international relationships like being on top of the Big Ten or the Rose Bowl winner. And our politicians, and we need an educational system that undeceives us from this childish idea of what it means to be great. So I don't think that the end of the prominence of the World War II generation means that the empire will be rolled back whatsoever. I mean, Obama is an example. He really isn't part of the World War II. He's past the World War II generation.
You don't get the World War II generation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, no, wait. I have one. This is the first speaker's privilege. I want to pay homage to John Whitehead, because what he's doing on the local level is exactly what's needed. Say, and Nat Hentoff got it right, the Paul Revere of the United States. The question is whether there anybody who's listening. It's really not the British are coming. It's we are. We've met the enemy, and we are they.
Yeah.
And we need to make John Whiteheads the heroes of our communities if we're ultimately to succeed and move forward. And that's why you all should feel very honored and privileged that you're under his tutelage and guidance, because he's a very special person.
You are too, Bruce. Thank you very much.
Thank you.